India tells a story about itself. The story goes, a country that was poor opened its gates, growth poured in, and a civilization rose to take its place among the world's great economies. The story is not a lie, but it is not the whole truth. This deck is the rest of the story. The Savage State is a forensic examination of India's $3.7 trillion economy. Not to deny that growth happened, but to ask the question that official narratives are designed to prevent you from asking, who does it belong to? The number you see here is real. 12% is also real. The Bahuyans. The SC, street, and OBC communities who make up most of India collectively hold only 12% of the nation's wealth. The upper strata hold the rest. This is not a development gap. This is not a temporary unevenness that economic growth will eventually equalize. This is the structure. This is what the miracle was designed to produce. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar understood in 1936 what India's economic establishment still refuses to confront in 2026. Caste is not a social custom that modernity will dissolve. It is an economic system. A property rights regime, a labor allocation mechanism, a hereditary network that self-replicates across every generation. What follows is not comfortable. It is not designed to be. This deck exists in the tradition Ambedkar established when he wrote Annihilation of Caste, the tradition of naming the structure clearly enough that those inside it cannot pretend not to see it. What began as 20 slides became 50 because systems this deep cannot be explained in fragments. Every layer revealed another beneath it. The Savage State. $3.7 trillion. Large enough to end most conversations before they begin. In 1991, when India dismantled the License Raj and opened its economy to foreign capital, the GDP was $277 billion. By 2024, 33 years later, it had grown to $3.7 trillion, a 13-fold expansion, fifth largest economy on Earth, a trajectory that has genuinely dazzled the world. This number is not fabricated. Growth happened, code was written, steel was forged, satellites were launched, pharmaceuticals were exported, software contracts were signed in Bangalore and delivered to clients in Houston and Frankfurt and Tokyo. At the level of the national economy, the miracle was real. On November 14, 2024, India's Finance Ministry announced the crossing of the $3.7 trillion threshold. The Prime Minister declared it proof of Viksit Bharat. Developed India. Markets surged. The announcement was framed as proof that India had finally arrived. And in the villages of Vidarbha, 300 kilometers from Mumbai's financial towers, the number meant nothing at all. The next 4 slides explain why. GDP measures total output, not human welfare, not distribution, not who owns what. It is an average. And averages are only meaningful when the underlying distribution is not wildly skewed. When 1% captures 40% of the wealth, the average tells you about the outliers, not about the median person. $3.7 trillion is the starting point of this inquiry, not the conclusion. Look at the left side of this slide. The blue growth line, clean, ascending, 13-fold in 33 years. The visual language of undeniable success. Now look at the right side, the amber map. The extraction zones where malnutrition rates in children exceed 40%. The heat in Vidarbha where thousands of farmers died by suicide between 2014 and 2024. The darkened corridors of Bastar, Bundelkhand, Kalahandi. Regions producing crops and minerals and labor for the economy you see in the blue line, while receiving almost none of its returns. The two sides of this slide exist simultaneously. That is the GDP trap. GDP is an average. India's GDP per capita in 2024 is approximately $2,700. Plot this on an international comparison chart and India looks like a lower middle-income country, developing steadily. But this average conceals ratios that reveal how little it actually explains. The per capita wealth in Malabar Hill, Mumbai's most elite neighborhood, estimated at $50,000 or more. The per capita wealth in Vidarbha's cotton belt, roughly $800. The ratio between them. Within the same state of Maharashtra. is approximately 62 to 1. At the national level, the average upper caste household holds roughly $15,000 in per capita wealth, against roughly $1,000 for the average Dalit household, a ratio of 15 to 1. An average of these wildly unequal populations produces the official GDP per capita. That number is technically accurate and practically meaningless for understanding the lived experience of the 75 to 85% of Indians who are not in the bright corridor. Growth happened. Deprivation persisted. Both things are simultaneously true. And understanding how requires moving beyond the aggregate. Between 2005 and 2021, 414 million Indians escaped multidimensional poverty. The UNDP called it the largest poverty reduction achievement in human history. The Indian government celebrated it. They were right to. But there is another reality beneath this achievement. This fact, repeated without examining what it actually measures, is one of the most effective tools of misdirection in contemporary Indian political discourse. Here is what escaping multidimensional poverty means. You now have slightly more food, slightly cleaner water, a school that exists within reach. Here is what it does not mean. You have a savings account, a pension, formal employment, health insurance, or any meaningful stake in the ownership of the economy whose GDP is being celebrated at Davos. The staircase on this slide has 50 floors. 414 million people climbed from the basement to the ground floor. This is real and worth celebrating. But the escalator stops at floor 2. Floors 3 through 50 require something that poverty reduction programs do not provide: the accumulation of land, social networks, inherited capital, English proficiency, and institutional access that have been systematically denied to scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes for generations. Among the 231.8 million Indians still multidimensionally poor in 2025, 70% are SC, Street, or OBC. This is not a coincidence. The pattern of their poverty is structurally reproduced by the same system that produced their historical exclusion. Poverty exit is good. Confusing it with economic justice is not. The ratio on this slide is 15 to 1. The average upper caste household, estimated per capita wealth of approximately $15,000. The average Dalit household, approximately $1,000. These are not income statistics. Income can fluctuate within a lifetime. Wealth compounds across generations. It is the compound interest of historical advantage and historical exclusion. The $15,000 figure reflects land inherited under the zamindari system, businesses passed down through caste networks, education bought across 3 generations, and social capital accrued across centuries of access to state institutions. The $1,000 figure reflects the inverse: generations without land ownership, without access to credit, without education beyond primary level, without the social network that opens a door before a resume is even reviewed. 2 people in the same country, working in the same economy, on opposite sides of a wealth ratio that market forces will not close and growth statistics will not reveal. Maharashtra is the sharpest illustration. Maharashtra is India's richest state. Mumbai is its financial capital. And within Maharashtra, within 300 kilometers, the ratio between Malabar Hill wealth and Vidarbha wealth is estimated at 62 to 1. Same state, same constitutional protections, same market, different countries. This is not a development lag. This is not a problem that will solve itself. It is a structure. And the next 45 slides are its anatomy. 2 bars, 2 numbers, 1 devastating story. In 2000, India's top 1% held approximately 25% of national wealth. By 2023, they held 40.1%. In relative terms, that is a 61% increase in their wealth share in 23 years. The G20 Global Inequality Report, published in November 2025 and led by Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, identifies this as the fastest wealth concentration growth in any major democracy, faster than the United States, where the equivalent growth was 50% since 1980, faster than China at 54%. India is not just unequal, it is becoming more unequal faster than any comparable economy. The conventional defense is that this simply reflects the rewards of entrepreneurship. That a rising tide eventually lifts all boats, but this argument fails on the data. The bottom 50%'s share of national wealth, 675 million people, fell to 6% during the same period. The tide did not rise for them. The tide was redirected. The G20 report identifies three mechanisms: pre-distribution, who inherits assets before the market begins; redistribution, what the state does with taxes; and political capture, who writes the policies. India fails on all three simultaneously. The top 1%'s 61% relative gain is not the result of superior effort. The structure consistently concentrates gains upward. 6%. Not 6% each, 6% combined. 675 million human beings, half of India's population, collectively own 6% of the national wealth. The pie chart on this slide makes the argument without words. The top 1% slice is larger than the bottom 50% slice by a factor of nearly 7. The bottom half of India's population, in aggregate, owns less wealth than the wealthiest 81 billionaires combined. This is not a statistic about laziness. These 675 million people are among the hardest working people on earth. They build every road, harvest every crop, clean every office, drive every delivery vehicle, and manufacture every garment. The formal economy depends on their labor entirely. The formal economy's ownership structure excludes them entirely. Wealth is not the same as income. A person can work 14 hours a day in the informal economy and earn enough to eat without accumulating a single rupee of wealth. No savings, no land, no pension, no insurance, no asset that survives them. Their children inherit the same starting point. 6%. In an economy worth $3.7 trillion. The next 43 slides explain how this happened and why it persists. Look at this grid. 162 dots. Each dot is an Indian billionaire. Approximately 143 of those dots represent upper caste Hindu families. Brahmins, Banias, Thakurs, Kayasthas. That is approximately 88% of total billionaire wealth concentrated in communities that represent, at most, 15 to 25% of India's population. This is not a proxy figure plucked from advocacy literature. This is proxy surname analysis applied to Forbes and Hurun India billionaire lists. The same methodology used by economists at the World Inequality Lab and the G20 report research teams when direct caste identification is unavailable. The concentration is absolute. It is also invisible in mainstream economic discourse, because to name it is to name caste. And naming caste in economic analysis is still treated, by much of elite India, as a radical act rather than a factual one. Consider the ratio. 88% of billionaire wealth in communities representing roughly 20% of the population. This is a wealth-to-population ratio of 4.4. If wealth were distributed proportionally, these communities would hold 20% of billionaire wealth. They hold 88. The difference between 20% and 88% is not meritocracy. It is 3,000 years of accumulated structural advantage. Land, education, social networks, state access. Compounding across every generation. This is the summit of Indian capital. It has a caste. 0. Scheduled tribes. Adivasis. Constitute 8.6% of India's population, approximately 120 million people. They live on some of the country's most resource-rich land, forests dense with timber, hills dense with iron ore and coal, rivers running over bauxite deposits that power aluminum smelters for multinational corporations. Their billionaire count? 0. Not approximately 0. Not fewer than 5. 0. The communities sitting above the most valuable natural resources in India. The communities whose land was acquired, whose forests were cleared, whose displacement powered extractive industries worth hundreds of billions of dollars, have produced not a single billionaire from their own ranks. The sparrow surviving a hurricane argument is frequently deployed here, that the absence of Adivasi billionaires simply reflects the early stage of their development. But this argument collapses against the timeline. Adivasis have been integrated into the Indian economy for centuries. As the labor that built colonial railways, as the displaced communities that enabled post-independence dams and mines, as the forest workers whose produce entered supply chains worth billions, they contributed. They did not accumulate. That is not a development lag. That is a structural transfer. 0. The number is the argument. Caste equals capital. This equation is the central argument of this entire presentation. It is worth dwelling on before we move to the data, because misunderstanding it leads to misunderstanding everything that follows. Caste is not primarily a social custom. It is not principally a ritual inconvenience. It is not the quaint remnant of a pre-modern world that economic growth and urban migration will eventually dissolve. These framings are accurate in part. Caste does have social and ritual dimensions, but they serve to obscure its most consequential function. Caste is a property rights regime. It determines who can own land and who cannot, who can access credit and who pays usurious rates, who inherits businesses and who is locked out of the formal market. Caste is a labor allocation mechanism. It assigns hereditary occupations, permits or forbids entry to trades and professions, and creates a reserve army of labor. The informal sector. That is disproportionately SC and ST because their exclusion from the formal economy is structurally reproduced. Caste is a hereditary social network. It determines who calls whom for a job referral, who gets the introduction to the investor, who belongs to the club where business is actually done. The G20 Global Inequality Report identifies caste as a, quote, load-bearing structure of Indian inequality. Remove it from the analysis and the pattern of Indian deprivation loses its coherence. Leave it in, and everything becomes clear. Caste equals capital. This slide is the foundation. The first and most foundational pillar of caste as capital is land. Proxy estimates drawn from NSSO, ADIS, and academic survey data suggest that approximately 55 to 65% of India's agricultural land remains in upper caste ownership. 60 years after land reform legislation was supposed to redistribute it. Land is not simply one form of wealth among others. In India's predominantly agrarian economy, where agriculture still employs roughly 44% of the workforce, land ownership is the original form of capital. It is the asset that generates income, provides collateral for credit, transfers across generations, and determines social status in the village economy. The post-independence Indian state passed sweeping land reform legislation between 1950 and 1970, zamindari abolition, land ceiling acts, tenancy protection laws. On paper, these were among the most progressive land reform efforts in the post-colonial world. In practice, they were systematically evaded. Upper caste landowners used legal maneuvers, benami transactions, political connections, and bureaucratic access to retain control. The laws existed. The enforcement did not. The result, in 2024, is a country where the communities who plow the land do not own it, where landless agricultural laborers, overwhelmingly Dalit, work fields owned by the same families that owned them in 1947, where land as an inherited asset continues to compound upper caste advantage across every generation. Land reform was passed. Land didn't move. The single isolated node on this slide is the argument. In India's elite private sector, approximately 50% of senior positions are filled via referral. This is a widely documented phenomenon in India's organized corporate sector. It is treated as unremarkable. A natural feature of hiring, the efficient use of trusted networks. It is also a precise mechanism of caste reproduction. Referrals travel through caste networks. When a Brahmin hiring manager at a technology firm is asked by a colleague, a Bamia from the same community, to review a friend's resume, the referral carries the invisible weight of social endorsement, shared cultural capital, and mutual obligation. The Dalit applicant who submits an identical resume through the official portal, without a referral, without a name that triggers recognition, without the school that signals the right network, enters the hiring process through a different gate. The gates look the same from the outside. They are not the same. This is not individual discrimination. Though individual discrimination also exists and is documented, this is structural. A system where the most effective route to employment is not your qualification but your network, and where your network is determined, in large part, by where you were born in the caste hierarchy. The market is not open. It is a members-only club, and membership is inherited. 60% of upper caste Indians are English proficient. 8% of SC and ST Indians are. This gap is not a reflection of intelligence or ambition. It is a reflection of educational infrastructure. Upper caste families have had access to English medium schooling across 3 to 4 generations. Since the colonial period, when English education was the gateway to administrative and professional life, that access compounded. Private English medium schools, IIT coaching centers, study abroad programs. Each generation's advantage built the next generation's platform. For SC and ST communities, systematic exclusion from education for most of Indian history means that the English proficiency gap is not a single generation's failure. It is a multi-generational exclusion made manifest in a single statistic. In India's formal economy, the IT sector, the consulting industry, the financial services sector, the legal and medical professions, English is not merely useful, it is the operating language. Job interviews are conducted in English. Business emails are written in English. Board presentations are delivered in English. The social register that signals belonging to the formal economy. The accent, the idiom, the cultural references, is an English register. A Dalit engineering graduate with equivalent technical skills to an upper caste peer but without English fluency does not face a minor disadvantage. They face a structural barrier at the first gate of the formal economy. English isn't a skill, it's an inheritance. The tilted scale on this slide is not a metaphor about individual bias, it is a description of institutional capture. Approximately 90% of India's newspaper editors are upper caste. Approximately 75% of Supreme Court judges are upper caste. Senior IAS and IFS positions are dominated by upper caste incumbents to a similarly disproportionate degree. Why does this matter? Because these are the institutions that define what counts as merit. The Supreme Court adjudicates which reservation policies are constitutionally valid. Newspapers decide which stories about inequality are worthy of front-page placement and which are niche. The IAS shapes policy implementation in ways that either honor or neutralize legislation designed for equity. The IITs and AMS define which educational achievements signal excellence. When the institutions that define merit are staffed overwhelmingly by people from one caste background, the definition of merit that emerges is one that reflects and validates that background. The upper caste child who attended the right school, speaks the right English, knows the right references, and demonstrates the right social ease is not simply qualified. They are the template against which all others are measured. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require individual bad faith. It is structural. The natural tendency of any institution to reproduce the standards of those who built it and control it. Merit is the name given to inherited advantage. The scale has been tilted for a long time. 1991 is celebrated as the year India freed its economy. It is also the year India replaced one exclusion with another. The License Raj. The system of government permits, public sector monopolies, and centralized planning that governed the economy from 1947 to 1991 had significant flaws. It was inefficient, prone to corruption, and constrained growth. But it had one equity feature that its replacement does not. The public sector, where most formal employment existed, had constitutional reservation policies for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Liberalization shifted economic activity from the public sector to the private sector. The private sector has no reservation policy. It never has. This is the Great Exclusion, the moment when India's economic center of gravity shifted from a sector with formal equity mechanisms to a sector with none. By 2024, India's GDP growth is almost entirely driven by private sector activity. The IT industry. The signature achievement of post-1991 India. employs approximately 93 to 97% upper caste workers in senior roles. The argument against private sector reservation is that it would reduce efficiency, but this argument assumes the private sector's current hiring is driven by merit, which, as the previous slides on referral hiring and English gatekeeping demonstrated, it is not. The current system already departs from merit. It departs from it in a specific caste-coded direction. 1991 did not dismantle the license Raj. It transferred its monopolies to the private sector, where caste quotas don't exist. The two bars on this slide tell a simple story. In India's public sector, SC and ST representation in formal employment is approximately 15 to 20%. Because the Constitution requires it, because Ambedkar's reservation policy was designed precisely to create this representation, and because a century of exclusion from private capital meant the public sector was the only door that the law could compel to open. In India's organized private sector, SC and ST representation in formal roles is approximately 3 to 5%. Far below both the population share of around 22 to 25% and the economic contribution these communities make to the agricultural and informal economy. The divergence between these two bars is not accidental. It is the direct consequence of privatization without equity conditions. When the Indian state privatized airlines, telecommunications, and banking. When it withdrew from sectors that once employed millions in formal jobs with constitutional protections. It did not attach equity conditions to the transfer. It simply handed economic power to the private market, which had and has no equity obligations. India's GDP growth since 1991 is almost entirely private sector-led. This means the economy that India celebrates is one that has grown dramatically while the communities most excluded from ownership have watched from outside. Growth without accountability is growth without equity. This is not incidental to the miracle. It is its architecture. 87 out of every 100 Indian workers. No employment contract. No provident fund. No minimum wage enforcement. No right to organize. No sick leave. No protection against arbitrary dismissal. No pension when the body can no longer work. This is not the developing world's inevitable transition stage. Brazil's informal economy is around 40%. Vietnam's is around 55%. India's is 87%. It is among the highest for any major economy of comparable size and duration of formal market operation. The informal economy is not informal by accident. It is informal by design. An economy where 87% of workers have no formal rights is an economy where 87% of workers are unable to bargain effectively for wages, unable to accumulate savings, unable to build the kind of financial security that translates labor into wealth over time. This is a structural subsidy to the formal sector. Cheap, rightless labor powers the supply chain of every formal business in India. And who are these 87%? The caste data is consistent across multiple surveys. SC and ST workers are disproportionately concentrated in the informal economy. At rates of 92 to 95%, significantly above even the already high national average. The informal economy is not a remnant of underdevelopment. It is the operating condition of caste capitalism. The Venn diagram on this slide has near total overlap for a reason. The route into formal employment requires credentials, networks, and cultural capital. The three things that caste capitalism has systematically denied to SC and ST communities across generations. A formal job requires a recognized degree, which requires access to quality schooling, which requires money, which requires inherited assets, which requires land, which requires. We are back to the land pillar. It also requires the right referral, the right English, the right social ease that signals belonging to the formal economy's culture. As the previous slides documented, each of these gateways is caste-coded. The result is that SC and ST workers are not in the informal economy because they failed to qualify for the formal one. They are in the informal economy because the formal economy built walls precisely at the points where their qualifications would otherwise grant entry. 92 to 95% of SC and ST workers are in the informal sector. This is not a statistic about capability. It is a statistic about systematic exclusion from the institutions that transform labor into formal employment. Informality is poverty policy by another name. It keeps labor cheap. It keeps workers rightless. It keeps the costs of production below what a genuinely competitive labor market would demand. Informality is caste policy in economic dress. The cliff in this bar chart is the story. Formal employment in India. Employment with a written contract, provident fund, health benefits, and enforceable minimum wages is distributed along the caste gradient with such precision that the bar chart reads almost like a ladder of the Varna system. Upper caste workers access formal employment at rates approximately 6 to 8 times higher than scheduled tribe workers. The gap between SC/ST and upper caste formal employment is not a small statistical discrepancy. It is a chasm. Formal employment matters beyond its immediate benefits. Formal employment is the gateway to the accumulation economy. A formal worker can get a mortgage, can access institutional credit at regulated interest rates, can build a provident fund that generates retirement security, can access employer health coverage that protects against catastrophic medical costs. Each of these is an on-ramp to wealth accumulation that informal workers are denied. When formal employment is caste-coded, when access to it is determined more by birth than by qualification, the inequality it produces is not an income gap, it is a wealth gap, and wealth gaps compound across generations in ways that income gaps alone do not. Formal employment is a caste privilege, and the distribution of that privilege maps almost exactly to the caste hierarchy that Ambedkar was describing in 1936. 13%. According to the ILO's 2024 India Labour Report, only 13% of India's workforce is in formal employment. For a country that has been growing at 6 to 8% annually for 3 decades, this is a number that should be treated as a national crisis. It is instead treated as a development fact. Something that will eventually change as the economy matures. It will not change on its own. The 13% ceiling is not a development lag. It is enforced. The informal economy is the economic infrastructure on which the formal economy rests. Every garment in every boutique in every mall in every Indian city was sewn by an informal worker. Every building and every skyline was built by contract laborers with no formal employment protection. Every meal delivered through a food app was cooked by a restaurant kitchen with informal staff. The formal economy relies on the informal economy's cost structure. Formalizing 87% of workers would require paying living wages, providing benefits, and enforcing labor protections that would raise the cost of production across the entire economy. The 13% ceiling is not an oversight. It is the price floor kept artificially low by the systematic exclusion of most workers from formal rights. The informal worker powers the miracle. The miracle has no obligation to them. 11.6%. India's central government tax to GDP ratio is approximately 11.6%. The OECD average is 25%. Germany is at 37%. Brazil, a fellow large emerging economy with significant inequality, manages around 33%. 11.6. The people who own India do not fund India. The elite that has captured the largest share of GDP growth since liberalization pays the smallest share of its income in taxes relative to comparable economies. Wealth taxes are minimal. Inheritance taxes do not exist. Capital gains taxes are low. Corporate effective tax rates, after exemptions and deductions, are often far below the nominal rate. The mechanism is clear. The same communities that dominate corporate ownership also dominate political funding. Political parties of all stripes depend on corporate donations. The tax policy that emerges from this relationship is one that protects wealth from redistribution. The consequence is equally clear. A state with 11.6% tax to GDP has almost no resources to invest in public services. It cannot fund the health system at the WHO recommended 5% of GDP. It cannot fund the education system at the level required to close the English proficiency gap. It cannot build the rural infrastructure that would connect silent zones to growth corridors. Low taxes are not a sign of an efficient state. They are a sign of a captured one. When the state is starved of revenue, something has to give. In India's case, what gives is public services for people who cannot afford private alternatives. India allocates 1.3% of GDP to public healthcare. The WHO minimum recommendation is 5%. This is not a matter of poverty. India's GDP is $3.7 trillion. If India allocated 5% to public healthcare, that would be $185 billion per year. The political choice has been made not to do so. The United Kingdom spends 8.4% of GDP on public healthcare. Brazil, a country with serious inequality problems of its own, spends 4%. India, at 1.3%, spends less as a share of GDP on public healthcare than almost any comparable economy. What does 1.3% buy? It buys a primary health system that is technically present in rural areas but functionally absent. It buys government hospitals in cities that are chronically understaffed, undersupplied, and overwhelmed. It buys a public healthcare system that is so inadequate that even relatively poor families prefer to borrow money to access private care, because the public alternative is a risk they cannot take. The people who rely exclusively on public healthcare are not randomly distributed. They are the poor. They are disproportionately SC and Street T. They are the communities who did not benefit from the tax policy that starved the state. The broken public hospital is not a coincidence. It is a consequence. 62%. India has the highest out-of-pocket health expenditure as a share of total health spending among G20 nations. 62% of all health spending in India is paid directly by individuals. Not by the state, not by insurance, not by an employer, by the patient, at the point of need. For an upper-middle-class family with employer health insurance, a private hospital visit is a managed inconvenience. For a Dalit agricultural laborer with no savings, no insurance, and no formal employment, the same visit is a financial catastrophe. India's health economics literature documents what is called catastrophic health expenditure, defined as health spending exceeding 40% of household income after subsistence costs. Catastrophic health expenditure disproportionately hits the poorest households. It is one of the leading drivers of families falling back into multidimensional poverty after briefly escaping it. The cycle is cruel in its precision. A family works its way above the poverty line, builds thin savings over several years, suffers a medical emergency. A heart attack, a complicated childbirth, a child's illness requiring hospitalization, and is pushed back below the line in a single event. The state that could have prevented this catastrophe with adequate public health care chose not to fund it adequately. The private survival tax is not paid by the people who shaped tax policy. It is paid by the people who had no seat at that table. Land is the oldest form of capital. In a country where 44% of the workforce still depends on agriculture, land ownership is not merely an economic asset. It is the foundation of everything: income, collateral, social status, political power, and the ability to survive a bad harvest. The map on this slide shows what proxy estimates from NSSO surveys, All India Debt and Investment Surveys, and academic research consistently document. Approximately 55 to 65% of agricultural land in India is owned by upper caste households. These communities represent at most 20% of the population. This concentration was not produced by markets. It was produced by history. By 3,000 years of a caste system that prohibited Dalits from owning land in many regions, that assigned Adivasi forest communities to lives of forest access, rather than formal ownership, that built the zamindari system as a legal structure for upper caste families to extract rent from the labor of lower caste agricultural workers. Independence was supposed to end this. Land reform was the centerpiece of Nehru's vision for a new India. The laws were written. The ceilings were legislated. And then, quietly, systematically, they were not enforced. Benami transfers, family partitions that technically complied with ceiling acts while maintaining effective control, bureaucratic obstruction, judicial delays, political influence. The map looks in 2024 very much like the map would have looked in 1947. Land reform was passed. Land didn't move. Between 1950 and 1970, the Indian Parliament passed the most comprehensive series of land reform laws in post-colonial Asia: Zamindari abolition acts across 17 states, land ceiling legislation, tenancy reform laws designed to convert tenant farmers into owners. In 2024, the same families that owned the land in 1947 still own most of it. This is not mysterious. The implementation record of land reform in India has been studied extensively, and the conclusions are consistent. The families targeted by land reform had the political connections, the bureaucratic access, the legal representation, and the financial resources to avoid compliance. Benami transactions. Recording land in the names of servants, relatives, and trusted subordinates were used extensively to technically comply with ceiling limits while maintaining effective control. Judicial challenges delayed redistribution for decades. State-level implementation varied dramatically, with states dominated by upper caste political interests effectively refusing enforcement. The gap on this slide between the promise of 1950, 1970 and the reality of 2024 is the space that political will failed to fill. Land reform is not technically impossible. Kerala implemented it more effectively than most states. West Bengal made genuine progress during the Left Front period. The constraint was never the law. The constraint was the power of those the law was supposed to regulate to prevent the regulation from applying to them. Laws are only as strong as the will to enforce them. In the case of land reform, that will was absent. 10,000 farmers. In Vidarbha, eastern Maharashtra's cotton belt, more than 10,000 farmers died by suicide between 2014 and 2024. The NCRB Accidental Deaths and Suicides in India annual reports document this consistently across the decade. The pattern within those numbers is consistent. The victims were predominantly small and marginal farmers, overwhelmingly from OBC and SC communities, who had borrowed from private moneylenders at annual interest rates of 30 to 50% to fund a single cotton crop. When the crop failed, because rainfall was inadequate, because BT cotton input costs were high, because the minimum support price did not cover production costs, because an adjacent farmer had access to irrigation they did not, the debt became unpayable. No institutional credit, no crop insurance that actually paid out, no government relief at the scale required, no safety net. The math was always fatal. These farmers were not the victims of bad luck. They were the victims of a system that had withdrawn public irrigation infrastructure, allowed private moneylenders to fill the credit vacuum, kept the minimum support price below the cost of production, and left them with no option when the calculation stopped working. Vidarbha is 300 kilometers from Mumbai, India's financial capital. The farmer who died in debt in Yavatmal and the billionaire who signed a private equity deal in Nariman Point inhabit the same economy. They do not inhabit the same country. The map is not a tragedy, it is a ledger. Caste kills, not metaphorically, measurably. The research literature. MES 2022, Multiple ICMR Multi-State Studies. Documents a life expectancy gap of approximately 4 to 6 years nationally between Dalits and upper caste Hindus. In the most deprived regions of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Odisha, this gap widens to 12 to 17 years. A Dalit child born in these regions has a statistical life expectancy up to 17 years shorter than an upper caste child born in the same state, not because of genetic difference, not because of lifestyle choice, because of the systematic accumulation of structural disadvantage that compounds from birth, lower birth weight due to maternal malnutrition, higher infant mortality, reduced access to immunization, worse nutrition at critical developmental stages, more exposure to environmental hazards, and less access to health care when illness strikes. The two lifelines on this slide do not represent two different biological populations. They represent two different relationships to the state's willingness to protect its citizens. Upper caste families access private health care, urban hospitals, clean water at home, and nutrition security. These are not moral achievements. They are the cumulative returns on inherited advantage. Dalit families access overburdened public clinics, contaminated water sources, inadequate nutrition, and a healthcare system funded at 1.3% of GDP. The gap between the two lifelines is not biology, it is policy, and policy can be changed. The two silhouettes on this slide represent the same age. The difference in their size is not genetic. NFHS 5 data. India's most comprehensive national family health survey documents consistently that child stunting rates among scheduled caste families are approximately double the rates among forward caste families at comparable income levels. Even when income is controlled for, the gap persists. This tells us that the mechanism is not poverty alone. It is the intersection of poverty, social discrimination, and differential access to nutrition programs, antenatal care, and public health infrastructure. A stunted child does not simply lose height. Stunting indicates chronic malnutrition during the first 1,000 days of life. The window that is neurologically most critical for brain development, immune system formation, and lifetime health trajectory. A stunted child is more likely to perform below capacity in school, more likely to have reduced adult productivity, more likely to have children who are also stunted. The damage compounds across generations. This is not a natural phenomenon. It is not an inevitable consequence of poverty at the aggregate level India has reached. India's GDP could fund the nutrition programs required to close this gap. The political choice not to adequately fund them is a choice. And it falls most heavily on communities that were already most excluded from the economy. This is not genetics. This is policy failure made flesh. The dark hospital on this slide is not a metaphor about tragedy. It is a description of a budget line. India spends 1.3% of GDP on public health care. This is a number that was arrived at through a political process. Not a natural limit, not an economic constraint, not an inevitability imposed by India's development stage. It is a choice that is remade every budget cycle. For context, the WHO minimum recommendation for health system adequacy is 5% of GDP. The UK National Health Service, which provides universal coverage for 67 million people, operates at 8.4%. Brazil, a country with comparable inequality and a significantly smaller GDP per capita, manages 4%. India, at 1.3%, is near the global floor among major economies. $3.7 trillion, and 1.3% for health. The practical consequence is a public health infrastructure that is technically present and functionally inadequate. Government hospitals in major cities are chronically understaffed and undersupplied. In rural areas, primary health centers often lack doctors, medicines, and functional equipment simultaneously. The people who have no alternative to this system are those who cannot afford private care: the poor, the informal workers, the rural agricultural laborers, the communities without health insurance or employer coverage. They are disproportionately SC and street. One window lit in an otherwise dark hospital. This is what 1.3% looks like. Look at the city map on this slide. The bright corridors. The dense network of roads, electricity, water mains, drainage. Follow a pattern. They connect elite residential areas to commercial centers. They run through the neighborhoods that have had the political representation, the social connections, and the economic power to demand investment. The dark patches. The areas where infrastructure is thin or absent are not randomly distributed. They are the areas where Dalit Bastis, Muslim quarters, and migrant labor colonies cluster. Geographical segregation by caste and community in India's cities is extensively documented, and where residential segregation exists, infrastructure inequality follows. This is not conspiracy. It is the predictable outcome of urban infrastructure planning in a political system where voice correlates with caste position. Municipal corporators and state legislators respond to constituents who vote in organized blocks, who have the social capital to engage bureaucracy effectively, who can hold public officials accountable through media attention. Dalit and Adivasi communities systematically lack these levers. Not because of individual failure, but because civic voice is itself a function of the social and economic capital that caste has distributed unequally. Public investment is supposed to be the great equalizer, the domain where the state can correct for market inequality. In India's cities, public investment reproduces market inequality. The road goes where the power is. Infrastructure is not a public good. It is a caste-coded investment. Water is not merely a health issue. It is a time issue. It is an economic issue. In India, the distribution of piped water at home follows the caste gradient with documentable precision. NFHS 5 data shows that SC and ST households are significantly less likely to have piped water at home compared to forward caste households, even controlling for rural versus urban location. In practical terms, this means that in communities without home water connections, fetching water is a daily task. It is overwhelmingly performed by women and girls. Time spent at the hand pump. Sometimes half a kilometer away, sometimes more. Is time not in school? Time not earning, time not building the human capital that converts labor into formal economic participation. The calculation compounds. A girl who spends 2 hours a day fetching water from age 7 reaches adulthood with thousands of hours fewer in formal education than a peer with home water access. She is then less likely to complete secondary education, less likely to access formal employment, more likely to marry early, and more likely to have children whose nutrition suffers from her own poverty. This is not a water problem. It is a structural exclusion that uses water access as one of its mechanisms. Every hour fetching water is an hour not in school, not earning, not advancing. For some communities, that calculation has been running for generations. The 6 lit cities on this map represent India's growth story: Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, Pune. These are the cities in the investment brochures, the startup ecosystem reports, the foreign direct investment corridors. They are real. Their growth is real. Everything between them on this map is dark. Bastar, in Chhattisgarh. One of India's most mineral-rich regions, sitting above some of the country's largest iron ore deposits. Its Adivasi communities have watched those minerals extracted by corporations headquartered in the lit cities, while receiving neither the royalties nor the development investment that extraction was supposed to generate. Vidarbha, in eastern Maharashtra. We have already seen its ledger: cotton farmers, absent irrigation, predatory credit, 10,000 suicides. Bundelkhand, straddling Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. Chronic drought, water scarcity, and a feudal agricultural structure that post-independence development barely touched. These are not random places. They are the territories where the populations most systematically excluded from the growth corridors happen to live. The concentration of SC, street, and OBC communities in the silent zones is not coincidental. The miracle has a postcode. India's Dalits and Adivasis do not tend to live there. The dark map is not a development gap. It is a distribution decision. And it has names. The empty chair is not a design detail. It is the data. Proxy surname analysis of India's top 100 listed companies. The Nifty 100, by market capitalization, finds that approximately 85 to 90% of promoters and a comparable share of independent board directors come from upper caste backgrounds. The methodology is consistent. Surname to caste mapping based on validated academic genealogy research, applied to publicly available corporate filings. This is not an estimate from a single study. It is a finding that emerges consistently from multiple independent analyses, including work by researchers at the Indian Institute of Management and the World Inequality Lab's India Research Cell. What does a closed boardroom produce? It produces investment decisions that favor projects in upper caste communities. It produces hiring decisions that favor upper caste candidates. It produces corporate social responsibility spending that follows social networks rather than need. And it produces a corporate culture that defines professionalism, leadership, and capability in terms that happen to map onto the cultural capital of the dominant caste groups. The boardroom's caste composition is not incidental. It is the apex of the pyramid we have been climbing through this entire deck. The point where land inheritance, social capital, English gatekeeping, referral hiring, and all the other mechanisms converge into a single outcome: decision-making power concentrated in the same community that has held it for 3,000 years. The empty chair has been empty for a long time. Every stage of this hiring flowchart has a caste checkpoint. It is invisible. It is not written in the job description, but it is functional. When 50% of senior hires in India's organized private sector come through referrals, the formal application process is not the primary route to elite employment. The primary route is social. It runs through who knows who trusts whom, whose recommendation carries weight in the hiring manager's network. In a country where social networks are caste structured, where endogamy ensures that the deepest trust relationships are within the caste group, where community organizations, alumni networks, and business associations are overwhelmingly caste homogeneous, a referral-driven hiring system is a caste-filtered hiring system. The Dalit MBA graduate who applies through the official portal is not disadvantaged because the hiring manager is bigoted. Though individual discrimination exists and is documented, they are disadvantaged because the informal network that routes candidates to favorable positions does not run through their community. They do not have the uncle who knows the MD. They did not go to the school that feeds the alumni network. They are not a member of the community association that meets monthly. These are not moral failures. They are structural ones. The product of a social architecture that caste built and that the market, left to itself, reproduces. Your network is your caste certificate. The IIT Joint Entrance Exam is India's most celebrated meritocratic filter. 200,000 seats competed for by over 1 million applicants every year. Top scores open the door to India's most prestigious technical education, and from there to the formal economy's upper tier. IIT coaching. The preparation required to realistically compete for those 200,000 seats costs between 5 and 10 lakh rupees per year at top coaching institutes in Kota, Hyderabad, and Delhi. This is before tuition fees, accommodation, and living costs. The child of a Dalit agricultural laborer in Vidarbha, with identical raw mathematical ability to the child of a Bamia merchant in Pune, cannot afford this preparation. Their official application process is identical. Their starting position is not. The exam tests who could afford to prepare, not who deserves to succeed. This is the core mechanism of what Bourdieu called cultural capital. The way in which privilege converts itself into legitimate credentials that then legitimate the privilege as merit rather than inheritance. India's upper castes have spent 3 to 4 generations building the English proficiency, the educational infrastructure, the coaching industry, and the institutional connections that make success in India's meritocratic selection processes look natural for their children. The Dalit child who fails is told the system is fair. The Brahmin child who succeeds is told they earned it. Both statements are false, and both serve the same function. In 1990, Vietnam's GDP per capita was lower than India's. Vietnam had emerged from decades of war, international sanctions, and central planning. By most development metrics, Vietnam was behind. By 2024, Vietnam's Gini inequality coefficient sits at approximately 35.5, meaningfully lower than India's. Vietnam's poverty rate has fallen further and faster across its full population, not merely its dominant ethnic group. Vietnam's child stunting rates are lower, its life expectancy higher, its Human Development Index score on a stronger upward trajectory. The relevant difference is not economic policy at the macro level. Both countries liberalized, both attracted foreign direct investment, both grew their manufacturing and services sectors. The relevant difference is what Vietnam did with its feudal land structure at independence, and what India did not. Vietnam implemented land reform comprehensively in the north in the 1950s, and extended it to the south after reunification in 1975. Agricultural land was redistributed. The feudal landlord class was broken. The result was a rural economy where a larger share of the population owned productive assets, and where growth, when it came, had a wider base to lift. India preserved its feudal land structure. Growth came. Its base was narrow. You cannot buy equity with aggregate growth. You have to build it. Vietnam built it. India chose not to. Bangladesh's GDP per capita in 2024 is approximately $2,500. India's is approximately $2,700. They are essentially peers at the aggregate level. On child mortality, Bangladesh outperforms India. On female literacy and school enrollment, Bangladesh outperforms India. On the Human Development Index, which combines life expectancy, education, and income, Bangladesh has been closing the gap with India and has surpassed it on several component metrics. This is not a celebration of Bangladesh's development model in all its dimensions. Bangladesh has its own serious structural problems, including labor exploitation in the garment industry and political governance challenges. The comparison is specific. On equity-relevant human development outcomes, Bangladesh has extracted more from its comparable GDP level than India has. The explanation lies in what Bangladesh invested in. Bangladesh made early and sustained investments in female education and reproductive health. Through a combination of government programs and NGO infrastructure that is globally studied, female education and reproductive health investment are among the highest leverage equity interventions available. They reduce child mortality, reduce stunting, increase economic participation, and slow population growth simultaneously. India has the resources to make these investments at scale. The $3.7 trillion economy could fund the equity programs that Bangladesh built on a fraction of India's per capita income. The constraint in India is not capacity, it is political will. The scatter plot makes the argument at a glance. Plot major economies on two axes. GDP growth since 1990 on the horizontal and change in wealth inequality on the vertical. And India occupies a unique position. High growth, fastest inequality increase. No other major economy of comparable size sits in this corner of the chart. China achieved comparable or higher growth and also experienced inequality increases. But China's state has also made massive public investments in education, infrastructure, and poverty programs that India's revenue-starved state has not matched. Vietnam achieved high growth with more equitable distribution. Brazil grew more slowly but implemented more aggressive redistribution through programs like Bolsa Familia. India is the outlier because it combined three things simultaneously: rapid aggregate growth, rapid wealth concentration, and inadequate redistribution. The G20 reports three-mechanism framework: pre-distribution, redistribution, and political capture. Explains why India ended up in this corner. Pre-distribution was caste determined. Assets were already concentrated before growth began. Redistribution was anemic. An 11.6% tax to GDP ratio gives the state almost nothing to redistribute. Political capture was near total. The same families that own the economy fund the parties that set the economic policies. The outlier position is not accidental. It is the product of a specific set of structural choices. And structural choices can be unmade. The optical illusion on this slide works because both layers are real. Hindu nationalism is a genuine political force with genuine popular support. The religious identity it mobilizes is sincere. The sense of civilizational pride it invokes resonates deeply with hundreds of millions of Indians across caste lines. This is not manufactured from nothing. But the economic policies it enables are not neutral with respect to caste. The BJP's economic program since 2014 has included massive corporate tax cuts that disproportionately benefited large conglomerates owned by upper caste families, continued resistance to private sector reservation, labor law reforms that further eroded formal employment protections, minimal increase in agricultural support prices, and healthcare spending that remained well below the equity threshold. None of these policies required Hindu nationalism ideologically, but Hindu nationalism provided the political coalition. The Bahuyan vote mobilized through religious identity. That made them possible. The OBC voter who feels their Hindu identity threatened by religious minorities is less likely to focus on the wealth share figures. The Dalit voter who is mobilized through Ram Mandir is less likely to examine the private sector diversity data. This is not unique to India. Everywhere in the world, elite economic interests have found ways to mobilize the non-elite on the basis of identity rather than class. India's version is particularly effective because the identity being mobilized, Hinduism, is so broadly shared. Same God, different bank accounts. SC, street, and OBC communities constitute approximately 75 to 85% of India's population. In a democracy where every adult has one vote, this majority is the decisive electoral force. No government at the national or state level can win without substantial Bahujan support. And yet, this electoral majority holds 12% of national wealth. It is disproportionately in the informal economy. Its children stunt at twice the forward caste rate. It dies 4 to 6 years earlier. Its land reforms were never enforced. Its boardrooms are empty. How does the largest democracy on earth produce a persistent divergence between electoral majority and economic majority? The answer is multi-part, and it runs through every slide in this deck. It runs through the identity mobilization of Hindu nationalism that converts economic interest into cultural loyalty, through the media landscape. 90% upper caste editors. That shapes what Bahujan communities understand about their own situation. Through the education gap that limits access to the analytical tools required to identify structural causes. Through political parties that deliver symbolic victories. Reservations in name, temple builds, statue dedications, while leaving the economic structure intact. The ballot box is not the bank account. In India, the two have been successfully decoupled for decades. The 2027 caste census, by producing undeniable data about economic distribution by caste, will make this decoupling harder to maintain. The temple on this slide is crowded. Diverse. Hindu identity genuinely crosses caste lines in worship. The Bahujan devotee at the Ram Mandir stands in the same queue as the Brahmin. The stock exchange next door is different. The Bahujan has no seat there. Ambedkar saw this clearly in 1936 when he wrote that political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it social democracy. He was not arguing against Hindu identity. He was arguing that religious solidarity is not economic solidarity. That praying together does not mean owning together. That sharing a god does not mean sharing the GDP. The caste Hindu elite has historically been able to offer Bahujan communities two things: religious inclusion and political representation. Both are real. Both are valuable. Both are also insufficient. Religious inclusion without economic equity means that the Dalit devotee can enter the temple but cannot enter the boardroom. Political representation without economic redistribution means that Bahujan leaders can win elections while the wealth structure that elected them to manage remains unchanged. The decoupling of religious/political inclusion from economic inclusion is one of the most durable features of post-independence Indian politics. It is the gap between Ambedkar's vision, a social democracy, not merely a political one, and the reality that independence produced. Faith unites. Capital divides. Artificial intelligence is not neutral. No algorithm is neutral. Every algorithm is trained on data. And data reflects the world that produced it. India's AI systems are being trained on India's historical data, employment records that reflect decades of caste-coded hiring patterns, loan approval databases that reflect upper caste creditworthiness being validated at higher rates, school performance data that reflects the English proficiency and coaching investment gap, address databases that map onto residential caste segregation. A resume screening algorithm trained on 10 years of successful Indian corporate hires will learn, without anyone instructing it to, that certain surnames, certain school names, certain residential postcodes, and certain networks correlate with successful hiring. It will then reproduce this pattern at scale and at machine speed, without a human decision-maker who can be challenged, confronted, or held accountable. This is not hypothetical. It is the documented outcome of AI hiring tools deployed in the United States, where Amazon's recruitment AI was found to systematically penalize resumes that included the word women's. Applied to an Indian context where caste, not gender, is the primary structuring variable of inequality. The danger of AI in India's context is not only individual discrimination, it is the permanent encoding of 3,000-year-old hierarchy into algorithmic infrastructure that operates at a scale and speed no human intervention can easily track or correct. If the training data was biased, the model is biased, and India's data is 3,000 years old. The map on this slide shows the emerging infrastructure of India's digital economy. Credit scoring, loan approval, facial recognition policing, predictive policing. Overlaid on its existing geography of caste. The overlap is not coincidental. Credit scoring systems deployed in India's fintech sector. CIBIL, and the emerging AI credit models. Draw on data that reflects existing wealth concentration, lower savings history, lower formal employment record, lower asset collateral. These are the structural features of lower caste financial profiles, produced by the decades-long exclusion from the formal economy documented in previous slides. An AI credit model reads these features not as the result of structural exclusion, but as individual creditworthiness signals, and denies credit accordingly. The structural exclusion produces the data. The data produces the credit denial. The credit denial deepens the exclusion. Meanwhile, facial recognition policing, deployed in Indian cities with relatively weak oversight, has documented higher false positive rates for darker-skinned individuals, a factor that correlates with caste and tribal community origin in ways that India's researchers are only beginning to systematically document. The automation of inequality is qualitatively different from its human administration. It scales without additional cost. It operates without visible decision-makers. It produces outcomes that feel technical and therefore neutral. They are not neutral. Automation without equity audit is apartheid at scale. The last time India comprehensively counted its castes was 1931, under British administration, 96 years ago. The choice not to collect caste data in every subsequent census was framed, at independence, as a progressive one. Caste would be made irrelevant by not counting it. If the state did not measure caste, caste would fade. This was the Nehruvian hope. It was also catastrophically wrong. Caste did not fade because it was uncounted. Caste reproduced through the mechanisms we have spent this deck documenting. Land ownership, educational access, social networks, corporate hiring, infrastructure distribution. The economy ran on caste while the census pretended caste did not exist. The political consequences were predictable. Without caste disaggregated data, the state could claim that its programs were reaching the population equitably. Without caste-specific wealth distribution data, the structural concentration we have documented through proxy analysis was deniable. Without the number, the problem could always be called exaggerated, disputed, or contested. The silence was never innocent. It was policy. It protected the structure by preventing the structure from being named in official data. You cannot dismantle what you will not measure. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the practical foundation of every equity policy. If you do not know where the gap is, you cannot target the intervention. 96 years. The silence is ending. On April 30, 2025, the Cabinet Committee on Political Affairs made an announcement that will shape Indian politics and policy for the next generation. India will conduct a comprehensive caste census, beginning March 1, 2027. Budget, 14,619 crore rupees. Scope, every Indian household, every caste category, with economic data attached. For the first time since 1931, the Indian state will count itself honestly. The political significance of this cannot be overstated. Every argument that the structural concentration documented in this deck is exaggerated, that the proxy estimates are unreliable, that the academic research is ideologically motivated. All of these arguments will meet the official data of the Indian state's own census. If the caste census confirms what proxy analysis and academic research consistently shows, that land, wealth, formal employment, and corporate ownership are concentrated in upper caste communities at rates far exceeding their population share, the case for equity policy becomes not an ideological argument but an empirical one, backed by the state's own numbers. The loading bar on this slide sits at 0. 2 years from now, it will complete, and when the data comes back, the conversation about India's structure will change. Because you cannot continue denying a problem that you have just finished counting. The question is not whether the data will arrive. It will. The question is whether India will have the courage to use it. India stands at a fork. The road behind is the 33 years of growth without equity that this deck has documented. The road ahead splits into three. The choice between them is not determined by fate or by global forces outside India's control. It is determined by the political decisions that India makes between now and approximately 2035. Path A is transformation, the systematic implementation of equity policy. Caste census data used as the foundation for targeted redistribution, private sector accountability mechanisms, a tax to GDP ratio adequate to fund universal public services, and land reform 2.0. This path requires political coalition building that centers Bahujan economic interests, rather than merely Bahujan cultural identity. It is achievable. It is not easy. Path B is managed conflict. The current trajectory continues, inequality deepens, caste-based political mobilization intensifies, and the state responds with a mixture of surveillance, token redistributive gestures, and identity politics sufficient to prevent outright rupture, but insufficient to change the structure. India remains unequal and increasingly tense. Path C is structural collapse. Inequality reaches a threshold where the social contract fractures. Not in a single dramatic event, but in the cumulative weight of 100,000 local conflicts, urban unrest, rural agricultural breakdown, and the loss of democratic legitimacy as the gap between electoral promises and economic reality becomes too wide to bridge. 3 paths. The next slide looks at each one. Transformation is not utopian. It is policy, consistently applied. The sunrise on this slide is not a fantasy. It is a projection based on what happens to economies when equity interventions are made at sufficient scale and sustained for sufficient duration. The evidence base is international. South Korea's land reform and education investment transformed a feudal agrarian economy into a technology power in 2 generations. Brazil's Bolsa Familia, despite its limitations, demonstrated that targeted cash transfer programs reduce multi-generational poverty. Vietnam's comprehensive redistribution created the equity foundation for growth that lifted the whole population rather than a fragment of it. India's transformation path requires a sequence. First, the 2027 caste census, used not as political ammunition but as the empirical foundation for targeted equity programs. Second, a tax to GDP trajectory that reaches 22 to 25% by 2035. Achievable through inheritance tax, capital gains reform, and corporate minimum effective rate enforcement. Third, private sector diversity accountability, beginning with mandatory reporting and progressing to binding equity targets. Fourth, universal basic services. Education, health, water. Funded to the level that the evidence says is required rather than the level that the current tax base permits. None of this requires sacrificing growth. The evidence from comparable economies is that reducing extreme inequality increases aggregate productivity over the medium term. The transformation path is also the growth path. The question is, who has the political interest in blocking it? Path B looks like stability. It is not. Managed conflict. The maintenance of the current structure through a combination of surveillance, identity politics, token redistribution, and economic growth adequate to keep the majority above subsistence can persist for a long time, decades even, but it has a cost that compounds: declining trust in institutions, rising caste-based political polarization, increasing urban-rural fracture, and the slow erosion of the social contract that holds a democracy together. India's current trajectory includes several Path B indicators: a shrinking free press space, increasing use of sedition and WAPA laws against caste and land rights activists, growing BJP-affiliated vigilante violence against Dalit and Adivasi communities, and the gradual hollowing of the reservation system through underfunding and policy neglect. These are not the characteristics of a state solving its structural problem. They are the characteristics of a state managing the conflict that the unresolved structural problem produces. Path C. Structural collapse is not a single event. It is a direction. An economy where 87% of workers are informal, where agricultural regions face climate-driven stress without safety nets, where the social contract between the state and the SC/Saint majority is stretched across a 12% wealth share. This economy is not inherently stable. The question is whether the cumulative weight of multiple simultaneous stressors can exceed the political system's capacity to absorb them. Managed conflict is not stability. It is instability, deferred. This is not a protest. It is a program. The Ambedkarite Agenda is a 10-pillar policy framework derived from the evidence accumulated across this entire presentation. The diagnosis converted into a legislative and institutional prescription. Pillar 1. Caste census plus data transparency. Use the 2027 data as the foundation for every subsequent equity intervention. Pillar 2. Land redistribution 2.0. A renewed land reform effort, this time with judicial fast-tracking and constitutional protection against evasion. Pillar 3. Private sector equity mandates. Mandatory diversity reporting progressing to binding equity targets, beginning with Nifty 100 companies. Pillar 4. Universal basic services. Education, health, and water funded at international adequacy standards. 5% for health, 6% for education. Pillar 5. Tax to GDP at 25% by 2035, through inheritance tax, capital gains reform, and corporate effective rate enforcement. Pillar 6. AI ethics and caste audit. Mandatory bias audit for all public-facing AI systems. Pillar 7. Anti-concentration law. Monopoly regulation that specifically addresses the inherited concentration this deck has documented. Pillar 8. Bahuyan political representation. Electoral reform to strengthen proportional representation in state and national governance. Pillar 9. Education Equity Fund. A dedicated fund closing the English and coaching access gap. Pillar 10. Intersectional social protection. Universal basic income piloted in the 5 most deprived districts of each state. This is achievable. It requires political will. That will must be created by the communities this program serves. The first reform is not a redistribution. It is a precondition for all redistribution. Everything this deck has argued, the land concentration, the boardroom monopoly, the life expectancy gap, the informal economy trap, has been demonstrated through proxy analysis, academic surveys, and fragmented administrative data. It is robust enough to act on. It is not yet official enough to be undeniable. The 2027 Caste Census changes that. But collecting the data is only half of Reform 1. The other half is what happens to the data after it is collected. The Ambedkarite Agenda requires that caste disaggregated economic data, land ownership, formal employment, corporate directorship, credit access, health outcomes, be published annually by every central and state ministry, not filed, not archived, published, publicly, in disaggregated form, with year-on-year comparability. This sounds bureaucratic. It is, in fact, revolutionary. Every argument that structural inequality is exaggerated becomes untenable the moment the state's own numbers confirm it. Every politician who claims to serve Bahuyan communities while presiding over policies that deepen their exclusion must answer to published data that shows exactly how much their policy improved or worsened the numbers. Transparency is accountability's foundation. Accountability is equity policy's enforcement mechanism, and equity policy, as every subsequent reform on this list depends on, cannot be designed without knowing precisely where the gaps are, how large they are, and whether interventions are closing them. What gets measured gets changed. Everything else gets managed. India tried land reform once. It failed. Not because the idea was wrong, but because the implementation had no teeth. The Zamindari Abolition Acts and land ceiling legislation of 1950 to 1970 were among the most progressive land reform frameworks in post-colonial history. They were evaded through Benami transactions, family partitions designed to technically comply while maintaining effective control, bureaucratic delay, and the political influence of the landowning class over the state apparatus, tasked with enforcing the law against them. Land redistribution 2.0 must be structurally different in 3 specific ways. First, constitutional protection. The property rights amendments that allowed landowners to challenge redistribution in courts for decades must be foreclosed with a constitutional amendment placing land equity firmly within the directive principles as a justiciable right. Second, judicial fast-tracking. Dedicated land reform tribunals with a 2-year resolution mandate. Not the general civil courts where land cases have historically aged for decades without resolution. Third, anti-evasion technology. The 2027 Caste Census, combined with land registry digitization, makes enemy detection algorithmically feasible for the first time. Unexplained divergences between census-reported assets and registered ownership trigger automatic audit. The landless Dalit agricultural laborer working the same field her grandparents worked, owned by the same family that owned it in 1947, is not waiting for a new idea. She is waiting for a law with the political will to actually enforce it. Land reform is not radical. It is owed. The public sector has reservation. The economy moved to the private sector. This is the structural gap that Reform 3 closes. The argument against private sector equity mandates has always been efficiency, that mandatory diversity targets would force companies to hire less qualified candidates and reduce productivity. This argument has 3 fatal problems. The first is empirical. As slides 12, 13, and 14 demonstrated, the current hiring system is not efficient. It is caste-filtered. Referral networks, English gatekeeping, and informal social screening mean that the private sector is already not hiring on pure merit. It is hiring on network proximity. Equity mandates do not reduce the quality of hiring. They change the networks that feed it. The second is comparative. Every major democracy that has implemented diversity mandates in corporate governance, Norway for gender, South Africa for race, has seen boardroom quality maintained or improved, not degraded. The third is empirical again. Diverse teams demonstrably outperform homogeneous ones on complex problem solving. India's private sector, operating in a homogeneous caste echo chamber, is leaving cognitive capital on the table. The implementation ladder is 3 steps. Mandatory reporting in year 1, so the gap becomes undeniable. Public ranking in year 3, so reputational pressure activates. Binding targets in year 5, beginning with SC and ST board representation at a minimum of 15%. The market won't do this alone. The law must. The 3 dials on this slide represent the infrastructure of a life worth living: education, healthcare, water, not as aspirations, as funded entitlements. India currently spends 2.9% of GDP on education, below the UNESCO minimum of 6%, 1.3% on public healthcare, below the WHO minimum of 5%, and a fraction of that on water and sanitation, despite 20% of the still multidimensionally poor lacking adequate household sanitation. Universal basic services is not a welfare program. It is the recognition that a market economy only functions equitably when every participant enters it with their basic capacities intact. Educated, healthy, not losing 4 hours a day to water fetching. The market cannot produce these capacities on its own. It never has anywhere. The state must provide the foundation. The comparison to countries that have achieved this is instructive. South Korea's education investment in the 1970s, consistently above 5% of GDP for 2 decades, is credited by economists as the single most important driver of its transition from poverty to prosperity in a generation. Brazil's Bolsa Familia, despite being a relatively modest cash transfer, produced measurable gains in child nutrition and school attendance that compounded into productivity improvements a decade later. India has the fiscal capacity to fund universal basic services at international adequacy standards. If Reform 5's tax target is met, the dials on this slide move when the revenue exists to move them. Education, health, water. The 3 things a state owes every citizen before it asks them to compete. Every reform on this list has a price tag. Reform 5 is where the money comes from. India's tax to GDP ratio of 11.6% is not a law of nature. It is a political choice, remade every budget cycle, that has consistently protected the accumulated wealth of India's upper caste elite from the redistribution that a functioning social democracy requires. The OECD average is 25%. Germany is at 37%. Brazil, a country with serious structural problems of its own, manages 33%. Moving India from 11.6 to 25% by 2035 requires three specific instruments. First, an inheritance tax. India abolished its estate duty in 1985. Every other G20 economy retains some form of inheritance or estate tax, a graduated inheritance tax on estates above 10 crore rupees, affecting fewer than 1% of Indian families, would generate an estimated 80,000 crore rupees annually. This is not a radical proposal. It is standard in every comparable democracy. Second, capital gains parity. Long-term capital gains in India are taxed at 10%, lower than income tax rates for middle-class earners. Bringing them to parity with income tax rates closes a tax preference that disproportionately benefits the asset-owning upper caste minority. Third, corporate minimum effective rate. Nominal corporate tax rates mean little when exemptions, deductions, and treaty structures reduce effective rates to single digits for the largest conglomerates. An 18% floor, no exceptions. The revenue exists. The political will to collect it does not. Yet. The hospital on this slide is fully lit. Every window bright. This is what 5% of GDP buys. It buys one doctor per 1,000 citizens, against the current ratio of approximately 1 per 1,800. It buys free generic medicines stocked in every primary health center, ending the situation where government facilities are technically open and pharmacologically empty. It buys universal maternal and child health coverage that closes the infant mortality gap between SC/ST communities and the national average. It buys the elimination of catastrophic health expenditure as the primary driver of families falling back into multidimensional poverty. Reform 6 is not separable from Reform 4. It is its implementation in the single domain where the human cost of India's public investment failure is most directly measurable in years of life. The 4 to 6 year Dalit life expectancy gap documented in slide 27 is not a biological phenomenon. It is a funding gap rendered in human mortality. Every year India spends at 1.3% instead of 5% is a year in which the structural violence measured by that gap continues. The counter-argument that India cannot afford 5% fails against the revenue arithmetic of Reform 5. A tax to GDP ratio of 25% generates approximately $900 billion of public revenue against India's current GDP. 5% of GDP for healthcare is $185 billion. It is a choice about priorities, not a constraint imposed by fiscal reality. From 1.3% to 5%. The distance between a savage state and a social one. The same neural network from slide 42 appears on this slide, but the bias indicators are green now, not red. That change, from red to green, is what a mandatory caste audit framework produces. It does not eliminate algorithmic systems. It requires them to demonstrate, before deployment and annually thereafter, that their outputs are not producing caste-differentiated outcomes. Reform 7 has three components. The first is pre-deployment testing. Every AI system deployed by a government body, or used in a public interest function, credit scoring, hiring, loan approval, policing, school admissions, must undergo caste disaggregated outcome testing before launch. If the system produces statistically significant worse outcomes for SC and ST applicants when all other variables are held constant, it cannot be deployed. The second is annual review and public reporting. Once deployed, systems must publish their caste disaggregated outcome data annually, in a form accessible to the public and to civil society researchers. The opacity that allows algorithmic discrimination to operate invisibly is the opacity that Reform 7 removes. The third is enforcement. Systems that fail their annual audit are suspended pending remediation. There is no provision for temporary exemption, phased compliance, or voluntary commitment to future improvement. The standard is maintained or the system stops. India is at the beginning of its AI governance moment. The decisions made in the next 3 to 5 years will determine whether the digital economy reproduces the caste hierarchy, or is the first domain where that reproduction is actively interrupted. Neutral technology is a myth. Audited technology is a standard. India has antitrust law. The Competition Act of 2002 prohibits market dominance and anti-competitive practices. It has never been applied to inherited caste capital concentration. This is the gap Reform 8 fills. The concentration documented in this deck is not primarily the product of individual firms monopolizing specific markets in ways current competition law can address. It is the product of a caste network controlling multiple unrelated industries simultaneously. Energy, telecommunications, ports, media, financial services. Through a combination of inherited wealth, political access, and social capital that competition law as currently written does not recognize as a market failure. The anti-concentration law reform has three specific instruments. First, a meaningful inheritance tax, as detailed in Reform 5. Without an inheritance tax, every generation of upper caste families reconstitutes the same concentration from the same asset base. The concentration is not broken. It is renewed. Second, cross-holding limits. No single family group or caste network-linked conglomerate may control more than 25% of two or more strategically significant sectors simultaneously. This does not break up existing businesses. It prevents the further extension of network monopoly into new sectors. Third, a caste monopoly audit. Any industry where proxy analysis shows more than 70% of ownership concentrated in upper caste communities triggers an automatic equity review. The review does not mandate redistribution. It mandates transparent reporting and the development of an access plan. Concentration this extreme did not build itself in one generation. It will not unbuild itself without law. 75 to 85% of the electorate, 12% of the wealth. This arithmetic does not resolve itself without structural change to how economic policy is made, not just who votes. India's existing reservation system covers the Lok Sabha and state assemblies. It does not cover the Rajya Sabha. It does not cover the cabinet. Where economic policy is actually designed, it does not cover the finance ministry's internal advisory committees, the RBI's monetary policy board, the Niti Aayog's steering committees, or the planning bodies that determine which districts receive infrastructure investment and which remain silent zones. Reform 9 has two tracks. The electoral track extends reservation to the Rajya Sabha and to key local governance bodies that currently operate without demographic accountability. A parliament that represents the population in both houses is the minimum democratic standard. The executive track is more novel and more consequential. Mandatory SC/street/OBC representation. At proportional levels. On every economic policy body that shapes tax policy, investment allocation, labor law, and sectoral regulation. Not advisory representation. Voting representation. The communities most affected by economic policy must help design it. Not be consulted about it after the design is complete. This is Ambedkar's argument from 1936, updated for 2026. Political democracy without economic democracy is a managed pantomime of freedom. The connection between Bahuyan political power and Bahuyan economic outcomes is not automatic. It requires institutional design that routes political voice into economic decision-making. The people most affected by economic policy must help design it. The two pathways on this slide converge. In slide 35, they diverged. One path open, one blocked by the coaching gate. Reform 10 closes that gate and builds a single road to the same starting line. The English proficiency gap. 60% of upper caste Indians versus 8% of SC/ST Indians. Is not a problem that resolve themselves as the economy develops. They widen because the premium on English grows as the formal economy grows, and the investment gap in English medium education remains structural rather than shrinking. The Education Equity Fund addresses this at three levels. The first is foundational. Free English medium education from Class 1 in all government schools. Not optional, not pilot programs in select districts. A universal standard, with teacher training and curriculum development funded nationally, delivered in every government school in the country. The child who arrives at the IIT entrance exam without English fluency was failed by the system before they reached the exam room. The second is the coaching gap. IIT and NEET coaching at private institutes costs 5 to 10 lakh rupees per year. And the alternative, self-study without coaching, yields dramatically lower success rates. Subsidized coaching centers in every district with more than 30% SC/ST population change this calculation. Not charity, infrastructure. The third is transition support, a 50,000 rupee annual stipend for SC/ST students in grades 9 through 12. Covering the years when families most often pull children out of school to contribute to household income. Keeping the investment in education intact at its most critical window. Equal starting lines, that is all equity asks for. India's caste question is not India's problem alone. This is the world's largest democracy. 1.44 billion citizens, the largest democratic exercise in the history of human civilization. What India demonstrates about whether democracy can dismantle inherited hierarchy will shape the democratic model's credibility for every country that faces its own version of this question. The United States faces its racial wealth gap. Brazil faces its racial and regional inequality. Europe faces its treatment of Roma communities and migrant populations. Every democracy in the world has a version of the question India is confronting. Can a system of political equality coexist indefinitely with a system of economic hierarchy structured by birth, or does one eventually destroy the other? Ambedkar knew the answer in 1936 when he wrote that political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it social democracy. He was not describing India's future. He was prescribing its alternative. The choice is on the table. The census is coming. The data will arrive. The question that will define this generation of Indians, and, through India's example, this generation of Democrats everywhere, is not whether the structure will be named. It will be. The question is whether naming it will be followed by the courage to dismantle it. Annihilation of caste, not as a pamphlet from 1936, as a policy agenda for 2027. That is the savage state's only alternative.